ash drifts like grey snow across a frozen field. Men stumble through it, faces smeared with soot, clutching children who do not cry anymore. Behind them, the pines crack and hiss as fire eats the sap. Ahead, elven sentries shout into a wind that carries no answer, only the far-off thunder of drums from the north. In the smoke, a banner lies trampled, its bright star drowned in mud. If you enjoy cinematic Tolkien what-ifs like this, leave a like and subscribe so you do not miss the next divergence. And tell the story with me in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight, and which age of Middle-earth haunts you most? The messengers had ridden hard from Nargothrond and from Himring, cloaks stiff with sleet, eyes red from the glare of winter. They had crossed the river Askar, then the dim plains of Estolad, where men had gathered in scattered homesteads, new to Beleriand and still tasting fear like iron on the tongue. The elves had come with words that had saved worlds before: friendship, alliance, a place in a song older than the sun. They had brought gifts too, not as payment, but as promise. Blades that held an edge, bread that did not spoil, lamps that would not gutter in wind. In the long hall of a wooden stead, its roof weighted with stone against storm, the chieftains of the Edain listened in silence. Beor the Old sat nearest the hearth, his hands curled around a cup that had gone cold. Beside him, younger leaders leaned forward, hungry for more than food, hungry for certainty. Across from them stood Finrod Felagund, golden-haired even in low firelight, as if the flame had remembered him from some purer age. Outside, ordinary folk pressed near the walls to hear. A girl with a chipped bowl held her breath. A boy with a cut thumb wiped blood on his tunic and tried to look brave. Dogs whined softly, the hearing something in the elven voice that the ears could not name, but the bones could. Finrod spoke of the siege of Angband, of the long ring of watchfulness that held back the darkness. He spoke of the north, where ice never thawed and the clouds were stained with smoke. He did not ask the Edain to die for elves. He asked them to live with purpose. Then a man named Amlak rose, and his voice was hoarse from too many nights keeping wolves away from a pen. "We came west to escape a shadow," Amlak said. "We crossed mountains for that. We buried our dead on the far side of the world. And now you ask us to plant our children beside your war." A murmur ran through the hall like a mouse under straw. It was not defiance yet. It was recognition. Finrod held the gaze of every man in that room and offered no anger, only the weight of time. "There is no corner of this world where the shadow does not reach," he said. "If you do not walk into the storm, it will come to your door." Beor's fingers tightened on his cup. He remembered the east, remembered eyes in the dark and the way neighbors had vanished. He also remembered, painfully, the first time he had seen an elf. The calm, the beauty, and the quiet certainty that made men feel like children. "What do you offer us?" asked a younger chieftain, Haleth's cousin, his hair bound in leather. "A place behind your walls, a grave beneath your mountains." Finrod did not flinch. "I offer you the truth," he said, "and I offer you friendship. There are gifts that follow friendship, but they are not mine to give." That was the moment the world turned, not with a clash of swords, but with a choice spoken in a room that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. Beor rose slowly. His knees creaked. He looked at the faces around him, men and women who had followed him out of fear and faith, who had trusted him to find a land where they could breathe. He looked at Finrod, and for a heartbeat, he almost said yes. The song was so near, like a melody remembered from infancy. But then he heard the coughing of an old woman at the back, heard a baby fussing in hunger, felt the ache of exhaustion in his people. "We will not bind our fate to yours," Beor said at last. "Not now. We will trade. We will be neighbors. But we will not take up your war." Finrod's eyes dimmed, not with hatred, but with grief so controlled it felt colder than winter. "So be it," he said. Later, when the elven envoys rode away and the hoofbeats faded, the hall released its breath. Some wept in private, relieved. Some stared into the hearth as if waiting for sparks to spell the future. Outside, the wind rose, and somewhere far beyond sight, in a fortress of iron and flame, a dark power smiled without lips. The siege of Angband held for a time because it had always been held by elven vigilance and elven pride. Yet the watchtowers felt lonelier. The scouts returned without the footprints of men beside them. The passes were guarded by fewer hands, and when winter came hard, even elven stores thinned because there were fewer friends to share the burden of carrying grain through snow. In Dorthonion, the highland of pines, a shepherd named Rian tended a small flock belonging to his uncle. He was not a warrior. He knew only the language of weather and the soft impatience of sheep. In the morning, he could smell sap and frost. At night, he heard owls, and sometimes, faintly, the cries of things that should not have existed outside nightmares. Rian had seen an elf once, a hunter passing like a pale shadow between trunks. The hunter had paused to watch him, and in that brief stillness, Rian had felt absurdly safe. Now, on the first day of spring, the wind shifted. It brought with it a scent that did not belong in a forest, sulphur like burned stone. The sheep lifted their heads all at once. Their ears flattened. The birds fled in a sudden, frantic rush. Rian turned toward the north, and the horizon looked bruised. The sudden flame did not begin with an army on a road. It began with the sky catching fire. Out of Thangorodrim, rivers of flame poured, crawling like living things down slopes of black slag. Smoke rolled out in choking blankets, swallowing stars. Dragons, newly bred and hungry, tore through the gloom with bellies lit like forges. And beneath them came orcs in numbers that made the earth tremble. On the walls of Himring, Maedhros watched the northern night turn red and understood, with a clarity that was almost peace, that the long siege was broken. Horns sounded, steel rang. Men would have been here in another world, shoulders pressed to elven shoulders, holding a gate while archers fired above them. In this world, the battlements held only elves, their faces set like carved stone. In Dorthonion, the pines erupted into fire as if each tree were a torch touched by a god's hand. Rian ran, lungs burning, clutching his cloak over his mouth. Behind him, something heavy moved through brush. He did not look back until a scream cut off sharply, and he knew it was his uncle. He found a small ravine where snow still lingered. He threw himself into it, ice biting through cloth, and lay there while the world roared. Above, orcs passed, their voices harsh and quick, speaking of prey and plunder. Their feet crushed needles and bone alike. One paused near the edge and spat, the glob of saliva hissing where it struck the hot ground. Rian held his breath until his chest shook. Far away, Finrod stood on a ridge and watched Dorthonion burn. He remembered the hall in Estolad, remembered the refusals spoken gently, and for an instant the grief in him sharpened into something like anger. Not at men for choosing life, but at fate for offering only choices that tasted of ash. The firestorm swept through Ardgalen, turning the green plain into Anfauglith, the gasping dust. Elven cavalry that had once ridden under blue skies now choked on grit. Bodies lay half-buried where they fell, armor hot to the touch. The rivers ran black with soot. The Edain watched from their scattered settlements, and the dread that had driven them west returned, heavier because now it wore a familiar shape. They had thought alliance would bring war to their door. Instead, refusal brought war to their fields without any of the strength that might have met it. In a muddy yard outside a farmhouse, a woman named Adenel grabbed her son by the shoulders and shook him. "Do not stare," she hissed, though her own eyes were fixed on the sky. "Get the water, fill every pot, but the well, go." The boy ran. The air tasted like metal. A distant boom rolled across the land, and in the distance, a line of fire rose and fell like the breathing of a beast. When the first refugees arrived from the north, they did not bring stories of heroism. They brought blisters, burns, and the stink of fear. They spoke of a darkness that moved like a tide and did not tire. "What did the elves do?" someone asked in Adenel's yard, voice cracking. An old man with half his beard singed looked up, eyes bloodshot. "They died," he said, "and they kept dying." In that season, there was no Barahir to gather men and ride in desperate loyalty to rescue a prince of the Noldor. There was no band of outlaws sworn to a friendship that would ripple through history. Finrod fought his way back, wounded and diminished, to Nargothrond, carrying with him not the shining memory of men's valor, but the cold certainty of their distance. It would be easy to call the Edain cowards, yet they were not. They simply did what most people do when asked to gamble everything on a war older than their grandfathers. They chose the small, immediate mercy of keeping their children alive for one more winter. It was a decision made in kitchens and by hearths. It was a decision made with love. Love did not stop Morgoth's fire. Years passed in a tightening circle. The elven realms grew more isolated, their borders guarded by fewer allies. Trade became cautious, then rare. The Edain learned to look at elven envoys with a mixture of awe and resentment, because each time an elf appeared, it seemed to herald another disaster. In Nargothrond, Finrod walked beneath stone arches that still gleamed with lamplight. He spoke with Orodreth, his brother's steward, and his voice was calm, but in him was the sense of a great door closing. "If men will not stand beside us," Orodreth said, "then we must endure without them." "Endure," Finrod echoed softly, as if tasting the word. For how long? Orodreth had no answer. Who could? In Doriath, Melian looked into her mirror-like thought and felt the weave of chance alter. Thingol, proud as any king, heard rumors of men who refused alliance and snorted. "Let them keep their huts," he said. "We will keep our realm." Melian did not correct him. She had lived through ages enough to know that pride is a kind of blindness that even the wise choose, because seeing too much hurts. Then came a man named Beren, son of Barahir in another world, a name that should have been spoken with honor in elven halls. In this world, Barahir was a chieftain who never swore an oath to an elf. He kept his people moving, always wary, always searching for ground that did not burn. He taught his son to distrust promises from those whose lives stretched beyond the grasp of memory. Beren grew up hearing that the elves were beautiful and deadly and doomed, and that to befriend them was to invite their doom into one's own bloodline. When Barahir died, not in heroic last stand, but in a skirmish with raiders from the east, Beren did not inherit a legend. He inherited a caution and an anger that had no clear target. He wandered. He hunted. He stole when he had to. He watched orc patrols at a distance, learning their routes, because learning was the only way to stay alive. One evening, he came upon an elven scout bleeding beside a fallen birch. The arrow in the elf's thigh was black-fletched, poisoned. The elf's eyes snapped to him, sharp even in pain. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air smelled of damp leaves and blood. "Help me," the elf said at last, voice strained. Beren's hand tightened on his knife. In another world, he would have knelt, would have bound the wound, would have carried the elf to safety, and later walked into Doriath and changed the fate of the Silmarils. In this world, the stories in his head were different. "You brought this war," Beren said. The elf's lips pulled back, not in a smile, but in a grimace. "The war was here before you," the elf whispered, "before your fathers had names." Beren hesitated. The poison was already working. The elf's breath was shallow. Beren could have walked away. He could have ended it quickly. He could have saved himself the risk of being seen near an elf. Instead, he crouched, cut away cloth, and bound the wound with torn strips of his own sleeve. "Why?" the elf rasped. Beren's answer came raw and honest. "Because I am tired of ash," he said. He dragged the elf into a thicket, hid him, and waited through the night with his knife in hand. Twice, orcs passed close enough that Beren could smell their rancid breath. He did not move. The elf did not cry out, though sweat poured down his temples. At dawn, the elf's eyes were glassy. He gripped Beren's wrist with surprising strength. "There was a time," the elf whispered, "when we thought men would be our friends." Beren said nothing. He watched the light filter through leaves, green and gentle, as if the world still believed in innocence. The elf died before noon. Beren buried him shallowly and left no marker. He walked away with blood on his hands, and a question lodged like a thorn. If friendship had been possible, who had killed it? That question did not find its answer yet. It waited, patient as doom. The great battle that should have been Nirnath Arnodiad came anyway, because the elves could not accept slow extinction. They gathered what strength remained, sending messengers to dwarves and to men, to any who might still hear. The Edain argued in their halls again. Some remembered the sudden flame and said that refusing alliance had not saved them. Others remembered their children alive and said that any choice that kept breath in lungs was still the right one. A young warrior named Marak, not yet a lord, stood before his elders with a spear in hand. "We cannot hide forever," he said. "If the elves fall, Morgoth will come for us next." An older man spat into the fire. "And if we go, we die now," he snapped. "What good is bravery when there is no tomorrow?" Marak looked around at the faces of his people. He saw fear. He saw stubbornness. He saw love twisted into paralysis. "What will you tell the children?" he asked, when they asked why the world turned black. No one answered. Outside, rain began to fall, and the sound on the roof was like distant arrows. In the end, a few went, not as a united people, and not as houses sworn in honor, but as scattered bands of desperate young men seeking purpose. They arrived too late, too few, untrusted by elven commanders who remembered the refusal. On the field, banners rose anyway. The Union of Maedhros formed like a cracked shield. Elves marched with grim faces. Dwarves of Belegost came with masks and heavy axes. And among them walked men who had no true place in the host, and their eyes flicking from elven lords to the dark horizon as if expecting betrayal from both. Morgoth had already planted betrayal. Easterling tribes, promised land and plunder, moved within the ranks of men. Where the Edain might have stood as a counterweight, as a loyal core, there was instead a hollow space that treachery filled easily. When the battle began, it began with hope. Because hope is what the children of Ilúvatar do when the alternative is despair. Then the traps closed. Orcs surged from hidden ways. Balrogs strode like living towers of flame. Glaurung the dragon crawled into view, his eyes a terrible intelligence. And among the men, those who had sworn secretly to Morgoth turned their spears, stabbing allies in the back. Marak, fighting in the mud, saw a man beside him suddenly drive a blade into an elven archer's ribs. The archer's bow snapped. The archer's mouth opened in surprise more than pain, as if he had not imagined such betrayal possible. Marak screamed, not in fear, but in fury. He struck the traitor down. Blood sprayed warm across his knuckles. Around him, the battle dissolved into chaos so complete it felt like the world ending. For a moment, Maedhros pushed forward and the line held. For a moment, it looked as if the darkness could be forced back. For a moment, the story threatened to right itself. Then the eastern flank collapsed. A trumpet sounded from the rear, a signal meant to rally. It was answered by laughter from orc throats. An elven captain, helmet dented, grabbed Marak by the shoulder. "Where are your people?" the captain shouted over the roar. Marak's eyes burned. "They are not here," he said, and the shame in his voice was sharper than any blade. The captain's expression tightened. He did not waste breath on curses. He turned back into the press and died within minutes, swallowed by a wave of black bodies. When the battle ended, it ended not with surrender, but with silence, because there were too few left alive to make noise. The plain was littered with broken spears, shattered helms, and bodies in every posture of refusal. The air stank of blood and smoke and the sourness of fear. This could have been an ending. It should have been. And the elves had thrown their last great strength into the jaws of the north and had been crushed. Men had tasted betrayal from their own kind and learned the lesson Morgoth wanted them to learn. Trust is weakness. In the ruins afterward, a wounded dwarf leaned on his axe and spat a mouthful of blood into the mud. "We fought beside you," he growled at an elf who still clutched a banner staff. "Where were the men?" The elf's eyes were hollow, where they always were, he said, trying to survive. As winter crept in, the surviving elves retreated into hidden places. Nargothrond shut its gates tighter. Doriath's girdle held for a time, but the world outside grew darker, and darkness has a way of finding cracks. In a small village near the river Narog, a potter named Lalaith tried to keep her kiln warm. Her husband had gone to the battle and not returned. She did not know if he lay dead on the plain or wandered lost. She only knew that her hands shook when she tried to shape clay, because the ground itself seemed to tremble with distant marching. A neighbor came to her door one evening, cheeks red from cold. "There are men on the road," the neighbor whispered. "Not ours." Lalaith stepped outside. Snow creaked under her boots. In the distance, torches bobbed like fireflies. She heard a low chanting, harsh and rhythmic, and she smelled something foul, like old meat. "Orcs?" she breathed. "Men," the neighbor said, voice trembling. "Men with orcs." The torches drew nearer. Lalaith saw faces, human faces, lit from below in ugly orange. She recognized none. They wore scraps of armor and carried axes and spears. Some had symbols painted on their cheeks, crude imitations of Morgoth's devices. And among them walked orcs, grinning, confident, as if the road belonged to them. A tall man at the front raised his hand, and the group stopped with disciplined ease. He looked toward the village and smiled. "Food," he called. "Warmth. And women, if you have them." Lalaith backed into her doorway, heart pounding. Her kiln, her pots, her small life suddenly seemed like the most fragile thing in the world. This was what came after the great battles. Not glorious doom, but human cruelty given permission by a dark lord. In Doriath, the tale of Beren and Luthien did not become a song that softened hearts. Luthien still danced beneath the beeches, still sang to the stars, but her world narrowed. She heard of men who feared and hated elves, and she felt an ache she could not name. One night she confronted Thingol, her father, in his hall where pillars rose like living trees. "You have closed your borders to men," she said. "They are unreliable," Thingol replied. "They bring trouble." "Trouble will come without them," Luthien said, and her voice was not pleading. It was certain. Thingol's gaze softened, but his pride did not. "Do you think you know better than a king?" he asked. Luthien's eyes flashed. "I think the world is breaking," she said, "and I think we are breaking it further by refusing each other." Melian watched, silent. She knew that some wounds, once made, become part of the world's shape. The crack widened when Doriath finally fell, not to orcs alone, but to men driven by hunger and greed and whispered promises. Morgoth did not need to batter the girdle directly. He used the simplest weapon, desperation. A band of men, led by a chieftain whose children had died in famine, came to the borders of Doriath and begged entrance. Their faces were gaunt, their hands were empty. The guards hesitated. The girdle shimmered faintly around them, unseen but felt like a pressure in the air. In the end, pity overcame caution. They were let in. That night, knives flashed in the dark. The men opened hidden gates. Orcs poured through. The forest echoed with screams, not only of elves, but of men who had betrayed and found themselves betrayed in turn, for orcs do not honor bargains. Luthien ran through corridors lit by torches, hair streaming, bare feet slapping stone. She found a guard dying on the threshold of the treasury. "Where is my father?" she demanded. The guard's mouth worked. Blood bubbled. "Taken," he whispered. Luthien's breath caught. In another world, a man would have stood with her, would have defied a king for love. It would have carried her into darkness and returned with a Silmaril that would burn through history like a comet. Here, she stood alone in a hall full of smoke. She turned toward the sound of fighting. Her voice rose, and for a moment the air itself seemed to tremble. Some orcs faltered, eyes widening as if the song had struck them like a physical blow. But there were too many. The tide did not stop. She found Thingol's body near the roots of a great beech, his crown fallen into mud. His eyes stared upward, unseeing, as if still searching for a world that made sense. Luthien knelt beside him. Her hands were steady, but her face was pale. "So this is what pride buys," she whispered. Doriath burned. This was another ending, a darker one. A realm of beauty erased, not by an ancient enemy alone, but by the failing of trust between kindreds. Morgoth did not have to conquer hearts. He only had to convince them that hearts were not worth the risk. After Doriath, the coast became a place of ghosts. Survivors drifted westward, elves and men alike, hollow-eyed, dragging what they could carry. The sea wind cut like a knife. Salt stung cracked lips. In the grey light, the waves looked like hammered metal. Círdan the shipwright stood on the shore and watched them arrive. His hair was white with spray. His hands, once busy with craft, now spent more time lifting the wounded from boats. A child, human, clung to a plank and shivered. Círdan knelt and wrapped the child in a cloak. The child stared at him with huge eyes. "Are you going to save us?" the child asked. Círdan's throat tightened. He had built ships for centuries and had watched countless farewells. He had thought himself familiar with sorrow. This question made him feel ancient and helpless. "I will try," he said. He did not say what he feared, that the world had passed beyond saving, that the only mercy left was escape. In the hidden city of Gondolin, Turgon listened to reports that grew worse each season. His messengers returned fewer in number. His people whispered of doom in corners, yet his pride held him behind walls. He believed secrecy was strength. Then Tuor came, or rather, Tuor did not. In another world, Tuor was a man guided by Ulmos' will, a bridge between kindreds, a spark that led to Eärendil and the plea to the Valar. In this world, Tuor was born among men who had learned to distrust elven voices. When Ulmos' message came in dreams and in the sound of water, Tuor woke with sweat on his brow and shook his head. "It is only fear," he told himself, "only stories." He never sought the hidden way. He never stood before Turgon in awe. He never married Idril. Eärendil was never born. So the West did not hear a plea that could pierce the blessed realm. On a night when the sea was rough and the wind carried the smell of coming storm, Círdan stood on the deck of a half-finished ship and looked west. He thought of all the songs that spoke of Aman, of the powers that had shaped the world, of mercy that had come before when the need was greatest. He waited for a sign. The horizon remained empty. How long can a world scream before the gods listen? The fall of Gondolin still came, because betrayal finds what walls cannot stop. Meglin, bitter and twisted by desire, sold the city's secret. Morgoth's armies poured in like black water. The white towers burned. The echo of metal on stone rang through the mountains. Idril, in another world, would have led a desperate escape, carrying her child. In this world, she led an escape all the same, because courage is not dependent on prophecy. She guided her people through a secret tunnel, smoke choking them, sparks raining like fiery insects. A young elf stumbled beside her, sobbing. "There is no hope," he gasped. Idril's face was streaked with soot. Her eyes were hard. "Walk," she said. "Hope is not a door that opens. It is a road you choose." Behind them, the city died. In front of them, the mountains waited, indifferent. When the survivors reached the coast, they brought with them not a child destined to sail the sky, but only exhaustion. They gathered in camps that smelled of fish and unwashed bodies. They watched the sea and wondered if it could swallow them kindly. Morgoth's shadow covered almost all of Beleriand. His banners flew over ruins. His creatures hunted openly. Men who had refused alliance now lived under a harsher law. Tribute, conscription, the taking of children. In a muddy camp near the mouths of Sirion, a woman with wind-burned cheeks listened as a herald of Morgoth addressed a crowd of men. "You are strong," the herald said, voice slick. "You endure. Serve, and you will have bread. Resist, and you will have ashes." A man near the front spat. "We already have ashes," he muttered. The herald's eyes slid to him. Orcs shifted, amused. "Then you understand," the herald said softly. In this timeline, there was no bright ship to rise, no Silmaril on Eärendil's brow to become a star that even orcs feared to name. The sky stayed as it was, beautiful and indifferent, with no new sign of mercy. The War of Wrath did not come when it should have. The Valar did not march at the plea of a half-elven mariner, because no such mariner lived to plead. The world staggered on beneath Morgoth's hand, and the First Age did not end in cataclysmic justice. It ended in attrition. Eventually, even Morgoth's empire began to fray, not from outside assault, but from internal rot. Dragons fought each other over hoards. Orcs killed for sport. Men grew resentful under endless demands. In the deepest pits of Angband, Morgoth brooded, pouring his malice into the very substance of the world, and in doing so, he weakened himself like a fire that consumes its own fuel. When the Valar finally moved, it was not because a single brave voice had reached them. It was because the fabric of Middle-earth groaned. The seas rose strangely. The winds carried cries that even the Blessed Realm could not entirely shut out. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, spoke at last in the councils of the powers, and his voice carried the sorrow of every drowned coast. The hosts of the West came late, and because they came late, they came harsher. Beleriand broke anyway. Mountains fell. The sea rushed in. Whole forests vanished beneath water. The surviving elves watched their homeland sink, and there was no triumph in their faces, only a numbness that comes when grief has lasted too long. Morgoth was chained and cast out, but the victory was different. It felt less like salvation and more like surviving an illness that leaves the body scarred. Sauron, Morgoth's lieutenant, stood before Eönwul and did not repent. He bowed. Yes, because he was wise enough to bow when necessary. But in his heart, he had learned something crucial from centuries of men and elves failing to trust each other. He had learned that division is stronger than any fortress. When the Second Age dawned, the world was emptier. The elves built Lindon as a refuge, their songs quieter. Dwarves delved deeper, their halls lit by steadfast lamps. Men spread into the wide lands east of the Blue Mountains, hungry for space and for forgetting. There was no Númenor rising from the sea, is a gift to faithful men, or because there had been no faithful house whose loyalty had changed the fate of the First Age. The Edain had survived, yes, but survival without sacrifice had not become a legend worth rewarding. The sea remained a barrier, not a bridge. This absence was like pulling a keystone from an arch. The shape of history sagged. In time, men built towns along the coasts and rivers, practical and rough. They learned shipcraft in small ways, learned trade, learned war. But they did not have the long life of Númenorians. They did not have the inherited memory of standing beside elves in a just cause. Their kings were not raised on tales of friendship. They were raised on tales of betrayal. Sauron, wearing a fair form, walked among them. He came first to the craftsmen, because craftsmen understand creation, and creation is a hunger that can be turned. In Edain, he offered knowledge to the smiths. Celebrimbor listened, because even grief-stricken elves still loved beauty, and because he yearned to heal what had been broken. Middle-earth can be preserved, Sauron said, voice gentle, eyes bright. It does not have to fade. Celebrimbor's hand hovered over a half-forged ring, and his gaze flicked toward the west, where the sea swallowed the memory of Beleriand. "What do you want?" Celebrimbor asked. Sauron smiled. "Order," he said, "so that no Morgoth rises again. The rings were made, the 3, the 7, the 9. And when Sauron forged the one in secret, when he poured his will into gold and fire, there was no Númenor to challenge him at sea, no great fleet to threaten his shores, no human kingdom mighty enough to make him hesitate. When he put on the One Ring, the air in Middle-earth changed. It was subtle at first, like a pressure behind the eyes. Birds flew lower, wolves grew bolder. Men woke from dreams with their hearts racing and could not name why. The elves perceived the betrayal immediately and hid their rings. War erupted. Lindon stood, and Gil-galad fought with a grim patience that had been honed by too many tragedies. Yet without the strength of Númenor at their side, without a vast human host with steel and ships, the elves were a dwindling people trying to hold back an enemy who did not dwindle. Sauron took Edain. He slew Celebrimbor and hung his body as a banner. The smoke rose from workshops where beauty had been made. The sound of hammers ceased, replaced by the clank of chains. On the plains that would one day be called the Shire, ordinary farmers watched black riders pass on distant hills. They did not know what a ring was. They only knew that the air felt wrong, that the sun seemed paler, that their dogs barked at shadows. A child asked his mother, "Why do the crows follow them?" The mother pulled the child close and lied, because lies can be a comfort. "They are only travelers," she said. "Do not look." But the child looked anyway, because children look, and in that looking the future begins. Sauron's dominion spread like ink in water. He built Arda in Mordor, its foundations sunk into the bones of the earth. He sent servants into the east and south, gathering men with promises of power. He spoke to kings of the White Mountains and offered them rule over their neighbors. He spoke to horse lords of the northern plains and offered them victory in endless raids. He did not need to conquer by force alone. He needed only to keep the old wound open, the belief that alliances end in betrayal. This could have been another ending. The Second Age closed like a fist, Sauron crowned in iron, the elves retreating into hidden valleys and grey shores. men divided into client kingdoms under the eye. And yet, even in that darkness, there were stubborn sparks. In Khazad-dûm, a dwarf named Narvis' descendant, Borin, ran his hand along a stone pillar and listened to the deep hum of the mountain. The dwarves had heard rumors of Sauron's victories and had sealed more gates than before. Borin did not trust elves much, but he trusted Sauron less. "We should strike," a younger dwarf urged in the council chamber, beard braided tight. "If he takes the surface, he will come below." Borin shook his head. "He will come below regardless," he said. "The question is whether we waste ourselves in open war or survive to be a thorn in his side for an age." A dwarf at the back muttered, "Survival" again, with a bitterness that echoed the Edain's old choice. Borin's eyes narrowed. "Survival is not cowardice," he said. "It is a weapon, but only if we remember what we are surviving for." In Lindon, Círdan watched ships leave for the west, carrying elves who could no longer endure Middle-earth's slow corruption. He saw their faces, not dramatic despair, but quiet resignation. Each departure was a small death. One evening, an elf who remained approached Círdan on the shore. "Will men ever stand with us?" the elf asked. Círdan looked east, where the sky glowed faintly above Mordor even from this distance. "They might," he said, "but not until they are forced to understand what they lost." In the late Third Age of this altered world, the lands were named as they had been, but the names felt like old clothes on a different body. There was a place called Rohan, a wide sweep of grass under immense sky, but its horsemen rode with black sigils on their shields, compelled by oaths made to survive. There was a place called Gondor, the stone cities of the south, but in this timeline they were not born of Númenorian grandeur. They were older human fortresses, patched and repatched, now forced to pay tribute to Mordor in grain and sons. Minas Tirith still stood beneath Mindolluin, white walls dulled by soot and neglect. Its lamps were fewer, its courtyards held more weeds. At night, the guards listened to the wind and to the distant rhythmic pounding from the east, like a heartbeat that did not belong to them. In the Shire, which existed not as a bold experiment in peace, but as a neglected backwater, small folk lived in quiet, taxed just enough to keep them from growing too comfortable. They were not called hobbits in songs, because there were few songs left. They were simply the little people, good with soil and stubborn in ways even they did not understand. A miller named Hamfast, older and rounder than he had any right to be in a hungry age, woke before dawn and listened to rain tapping on his roof. He smelled wet earth and turned his face into his pillow for one more breath of warmth before rising to work. His daughter, Daisy, sat by the hearth, mending a shirt. Her fingers were red from cold. "Do you think the riders will come today?" she asked. Hamfast grunted. "They come when they come," he said. "Keep your head down. Speak politely. Do not give them a reason." Daisy's needle paused. "Is that all we do?" she asked softly. "Endure?" Hamfast's jaw tightened. He did not have language for rebellion. He had only language for keeping people fed. "That is what keeps you alive," he said. Daisy looked at the fire, and in her eyes was the same old thorn. If survival is the only goal, what is life? Far away, in a ruined watchtower on the borders of what had once been Arda, a man named Edain sat by a smoky fire and stared at a broken sword across his knees. He was a ranger, not of a great northern kingdom, because none had risen, but of a scattered brotherhood that guarded roads out of habit and stubbornness. He had heard old stories from an elf once, a wandering singer who had wept while speaking. There was a time, the elf had said, when men and elves stood together and the world changed. Edain had wanted to believe it. He still did. He was not alone in his watchtower. A woman named Maera, scarred across her cheek, sharpened arrows with methodical patience. And a third figure sat in the corner, hooded, small, hands wrapped around a cup of thin broth. His name was Rill. He was one of the little people from the Shire, and he was far from home. His feet were blistered. His eyes were wide in the firelight. He should not have been in a watchtower with hardened fighters, yet here he was, because Sauron's dominion had reached even into the soil. Rill had seen a tax collector strike his uncle for being short 2 sacks of barley. He had seen a black rider drag away a neighbor's son for speaking back. He had smelled the fear in the air like sour milk. And one night, in the mill where grain dust hung thick, he had overheard something that changed his life. 2 men in dark cloaks had spoken quietly, thinking no one listened. "The ring is safe," one had said. "Barad-dûr holds it. But there is another thing, a lesser thing, a fragment, a failed copy. The smiths of old tried to make their own to fight him. It was hidden. He is searching." The other had laughed. "Let him search, and nothing can touch him while he wears the one." Rill had not understood, but he had understood enough. There was an object of power, and powerful men feared it. In the weeks that followed, Rill found a small, strange ring in the mud, near an old stone foundation, uncovered by a flood. It was plain, iron dark, cold to the touch even in sun. He slipped it onto his finger out of idle curiosity and felt the world tilt as if he had stepped onto a boat. He did not vanish. It was not that kind of ring. But he heard, faint and awful, a whisper at the edge of hearing. Not words exactly, a pull. He panicked and pulled it off. His heart raced. He hid it in a cloth and buried it under grain sacks. He tried to forget it. He could not. He began to dream of an eye. Now, in the watchtower, Maera stared at him. "You are saying you stole a ring that Sauron wants," she said, voice flat with disbelief. Rill's hands trembled around his cup. "I did not steal it," he said. "I found it, and I did not want it. I still do not want it." Edain leaned forward, the firelight carving sharp lines into his face. "Why come to us?" he asked. Rill swallowed. "Because you are not them," he said. "Because you still watch the roads. Because I heard you do not bow." Maera snorted softly. "No one bows," she said. "They kneel. They kneel and call it living." Edain's gaze stayed on Rill, searching. In his mind, old questions stirred. Could a broken world still produce a turning point? Could a small person carry a weight that kings had failed to lift? He asked the question that had haunted Middle-earth since Estelad. "Who do we trust?" he said quietly. No one answered, because every answer hurt. They decided to move at first light, not toward Gondor, which was watched, not toward Rohan, which was compromised. They would go north, toward the old ruins near the Misty Mountains, where, rumor said, an elf still lingered in hidden valleys, guarding memories like embers. At dawn, rain fell steady and cold. The world smelled of wet stone and pine. Their boots sank into mud. Crows watched from bare branches. They did not see the spy on the ridge until it was too late. A young man in a dark cloak, face half hidden, who turned and ran when Edain shouted. Maera loosed an arrow. It struck the spy in the back. He fell, slid down slick grass, and lay still, rain washing blood into the soil. Rill stared, horrified. "You killed him," he whispered. Maera's face did not change. "He would have killed us," she said. "Later, slower." Edain approached the body and pulled back the cloak. The spy was younger than he had looked. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. On his wrist was a thin band of black leather stamped with the eye. Edain felt no triumph, only a tightening urgency. "They know," he said. In Barad-dûr, Sauron did know. He felt the tug of the lesser ring like a splinter under skin. He did not fear it, not truly, but he despised anything beyond his grasp. His gaze turned northwest. His servants received orders spoken without voice. "Find it. Bring it. Break whoever holds it." On the road, Edain's small band moved through country that had once been green and free. Now villages kept their doors shut. People watched from behind curtains. The smell of smoke was constant because everyone burned damp wood to hide cooking scents from patrols. They reached the edge of Rohan's plains as storm clouds rolled low. The grass bent in wind like an ocean under pressure. Riders appeared on the horizon, dark against grey sky, their horses throwing up clods of earth. Rill's breath hitched. "They will catch us," he said. Edain scanned the land. No cover, no forest, only open plain and the thunder of hooves. Maera's jaw clenched. "We run," she said. They ran. The riders gained quickly. The sound was monstrous, a pounding that shook ribs. Rill's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. He stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. Edain grabbed his arm. "Do not fall," he said, voice fierce. "Do not fall." A rider's shout cut through wind. "Halt! In the name of the Eye." Maera spun and loosed 2 arrows. One struck a horse in the chest. The animal screamed, a sound that made Rill's stomach twist and collapsed, throwing its rider. The second arrow grazed a man's shoulder and vanished into rain. The riders roared in anger and surged forward. Edain saw a shallow gully ahead, half hidden by tall grass. He shoved Rill toward it. "Down!" he snapped. They slid into the gully as the riders thundered past above, so close that mud sprayed into their faces. Rill pressed himself against wet earth, shaking. He smelled horse sweat and leather and the sharp tang of fear. Above, a rider reined in. The horse snorted. Hooves clacked on stone. "He is here," the rider said, voice low. "I smell him." Rill clapped a hand over his mouth. His eyes squeezed shut. In that moment, he felt the ring in his pocket grow cold, as if it had awakened. Maera drew her knife. Edain lifted his broken sword. The rider dismounted. Boots crunched near the edge. A shadow fell into the gully. This was a cliff that could have ended them. It almost did. A sudden horn call sounded from far away, not the harsh call of Sauron's servants, but a different note, older, wild, and mournful. The rider froze. Another horn answered, then another, echoing across the plain like voices waking. From the distant hills, a small band of horsemen rode hard, not in black, but in worn leathers with no sigil. Their leader held a spear upright, and his hair streamed like a banner. The rider above the gully cursed. "Rebels," he snarled, and scrambled back onto his horse. "After them." the patrol wheeled and galloped toward the new threat. In the gully, Edain let out a breath he had not known he held. Relief washed through him, sharp and immediate, like warm water on frozen hands. Ril's voice trembled. "Who are they?" he asked. Edain's eyes were wide, and not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope. "Someone who remembers," he said. They crawled out and ran the opposite direction, using the chaos. Behind them, the clash of riders and the cries of horses rose and fell in the storm. Hours later, they found the rebel band's trail and followed it into a fold of hills where scrub grew thick. There, beneath an overhang, the rebels had hidden supplies: dried meat, a skin of water, and a small carved token of a horse. Maira held the token, turning it in her fingers. "They are Rohirrim," she said, voice quiet. "Or what is left of them." Ril looked at the token as if it were a holy thing. "They fought for strangers," he whispered. "For us." Edain's gaze lifted toward the east, where Mordor lay beyond sight. "They fought for themselves," he said, "but they did it by defying fear. That is how it starts." Night fell. The rain eased. Clouds broke enough to show a few stars, cold and distant. Ril stared up at them and thought of the Elves' words long ago, the ones Beren had heard, a time when men and elves thought they could be friends. Could friendship be rebuilt after so much betrayal? Could a single act of courage spread? In the hidden valley near the Misty Mountains, they found an elf at last, as rumor promised. He was not a lord in shining armor. He was a thin, weary figure with grey hair, standing beside a stream with his hands submerged in cold water, as if trying to wash time off his skin. He looked up as they approached, and his eyes sharpened. "You are far from any safe road," he said. Edain stepped forward, bowing slightly. "We are all far from safety," he replied. "We seek counsel." The elf's gaze moved to Ril, then to Maira's arrows, then back to Edain's broken sword. "What do you carry?" the elf asked. Ril's mouth went dry. He reached into his coat slowly and drew out the cloth-wrapped ring. He held it as if it might bite. The elf did not reach for it. He did not recoil either. He simply looked, and in his face was a sorrow that seemed older than rivers. "So," he said softly, "the old craft fails to die." Edain's voice tightened. "Can it help us?" he asked. "Can it hurt him?" The elf's eyes lifted, meeting Edain's directly. "It can draw his gaze," he said. "It can call his servants. It can corrupt whoever holds it if it was made with the wrong hunger. But destroy him?" He shook his head. "Not while he holds the one." Maira's hands curled into fists. "Then what do we do?" she demanded. "Hide until we die?" The elf's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened. "There is one way," he said. "The same way there has always been. You take what he thinks untouchable and you unmake it where it was made." Ril's skin went cold. "You mean Barad-dûr," he whispered. The elf nodded once. "Not Barad-dûr," he corrected. "Orodruin, the fire." Edain stared, mind racing through distances and patrols and hopeless odds. Without Gondor's might, without a last alliance, without armies, this was madness. And yet, in madness, there was a strange clarity. The old question returned, sharper now. If kings cannot do it, who can? The elf answered without being asked, as if he had watched history long enough to hear unspoken thoughts. "Not an army," he said. "An army announces itself. An army invites annihilation. You will go small. You will go quiet. You will go with trust, or you will not go at all. Trust." The word hung in the air like a blade. Eron looked at Maera. She looked back, eyes flinty. He looked at Rill, who seemed one heartbeat away from bolting. "What if we fail?" Rill asked, voice thin. The elf's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked unbearably tired. "Then Middle-earth will be a prison until the world ends," he said. Silence followed. The stream murmured. Leaves shifted in a faint breeze. Ordinary sounds, indifferent to the weight of the decision. Erin reached out slowly and closed Rill's fingers around the cloth-wrapped ring again, pushing it back toward him. "You found it," Erin said. "You carried it here. Will you carry it farther?" Rill's eyes filled with tears that he blinked away angrily. "I do not want to be brave," he said. "No one does," Maera replied, voice rough. "They just get tired of being afraid." Rill drew a shaking breath and nodded once. They left the valley before dawn, guided by the elf's quiet directions through paths that avoided main roads. The journey became a series of sensory memories. Bitter berries eaten with numb fingers, the sting of smoke in the eyes as they passed burned homesteads, the distant howl of wolves that sounded almost human, the way the sun looked sickly through perpetual haze. In Gondor, such as it was, a captain named Hadorian stood on the wall of Minas Tirith and watched a column of Mordor's troops march through the Pelennor. He smelled sweat and oil and the faint sweetness of decay. His men stood rigid, hands on spears, forced to salute as the black banners passed. A young soldier beside him swallowed hard. "Captain," the soldier whispered, "will it always be like this?" Hadorian did not answer immediately. He had spent his life in a city that remembered greatness without having lived it. He had heard scraps of old stories about Númenor, about kings who fought the shadow with pride. In this world, those stories were like myths from a different species. Finally, Hadorian said, "Not always." The soldier turned, startled. "You believe that?" he asked. Hadorian's eyes stayed on the marching troops. "I believe," he said carefully, "that there are always people who cannot endure forever." In Rohan, a rebel horseman named Eofred lay in tall grass after the skirmish, bleeding from a cut on his thigh. He pressed a hand to it, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers. His friend knelt beside him, face pale. "We drew them off," the friend said. "We saved someone." Eofred laughed softly, and more cough than laugh. "Someone small," he murmured. "Someone ordinary. That is how it always is not it? It is never the kings." His friend frowned. "What do you mean?" Eofred stared at the sky, where clouds moved like slow herds. "My grandmother told me," he said, voice fading, "that long ago men chose not to stand with elves, and we have been paying for it ever since." His friend shook his head, confused, but Eofred was already slipping away. His last breath left him as a sigh. Unexpected death, simple and unrecorded, the kind that fills the world when great wars grind on. On the borders of Mordor, Iran's band watched the land change. Grass gave way to scrub, scrub to ash. The air grew hotter, tasting of sulfur. The horizon shimmered with heat even in morning. In the distance, Barad-dûr rose, not just tall, but oppressive, like a thought you cannot escape. Rill's face was streaked with grime. He stared at the tower and whispered, "How can anything live here?" Maera's voice was flat. "Nothing lives," she said. "It only obeys." They moved by night now, hiding by day in cracks of rock. Once they lay pressed against the ground as a Nazgul passed overhead, its presence like ice poured into the mind. Rill bit his knuckles until he tasted blood to keep from screaming. Aaron's vision blurred as despair tried to settle into him like a heavy cloak. The lesser ring in Rill's pocket grew colder as they neared Orodruin. It pulsed at times, as if eager. Rill began to speak in his sleep, murmuring words that were not his own. Maera listened, eyes narrowed. "It is in him," she said to Aaron quietly. "It is working." Aaron watched Rill shiver in restless sleep, and something in him broke open. Not fear, but compassion. This small being had never asked to carry any of this. None of them had, yet the world demanded payment anyway. Aaron knelt beside Rill and spoke softly, not to wake him, but to anchor himself. "You are not alone," he said. "You are not alone." In the last approach to the mountain, they were discovered. It was inevitable. A patrol of orcs found their trail, sniffing like dogs. A shout went up. Horns blared, crude and triumphant. They ran through a ravine choked with ash. The ground crunched underfoot. The air burned their throats. Behind them, orcs poured in, clattering, yelping, eager. Maera turned and fired until her quiver was empty. Each arrow struck flesh, and each kill bought seconds. Then she drew her knife. "Go!" she shouted. "Do not stop!" Aaron grabbed her arm. "Together," he said. Maera's eyes flashed. "Do not make my death meaningless," she snapped. It was not melodrama. It was a hard calculation spoken with the clarity of someone who had lived too long with brutality. She shoved him away and turned back into the ravine, knife raised. Orcs crashed into her. She vanished beneath them, still stabbing, still fighting. Her scream was short. Then it was gone. Rill's sob choked in his throat, but Aaron dragged him onward, her fingers bruising his arm. They climbed toward a narrow path that wound up the flank of Orodruin. Lava's glow pulsed in the fissures. The heat was unbearable. Sweat poured down their faces, evaporating almost instantly. The air smelled of brimstone and burned rock. At the gate of Samath Naur, they found a figure waiting. Not an orc, not a Nazgul, but a man in black armor, his face visible, eyes cold. Hadorian. He had left Minas Tirith days earlier under pretense of escorting tribute. In secret, he had followed whispers of a small band moving toward Mordor. Something in him, some ember, had demanded he see it. Now he stood in their path, sword drawn. Aaron froze, lifting his broken blade. Hadorian's gaze flicked to Rill. "Give it to me," Hadorian said. Rill clutched the ring through cloth, eyes wide. "No," Aaron said, voice low. Hadorian's jaw tightened. "You do not understand," he said. "I can walk into Barad-dûr with it. I have rank. I have the right words. I can get close." "And then?" Aaron demanded. "Then you become what they are." Hadorian's eyes flashed with anger, and beneath it, desperation. "You think hiding and crawling changes anything?" he snapped. "We need power. Power!" The word that had ruined so many. Rill's voice shook. "I do not want power," he whispered. "I want my home." Hadorian stared at him as if he had never considered such a simple desire could matter. Then his expression hardened. "You will die for it," he said. Aaron stepped forward, broken sword lifting. "So will you," he replied. They fought in the narrow ash path, blades scraping stone. Hadorian was trained, strong. Aaron was stubborn, fueled by grief. Sparks flew when steel struck. Heat shimmered around them. Rill pressed himself against the rock wall, trembling, watching men kill each other while the dark tower loomed behind them, as if the world itself demanded this pattern. Division, betrayal, blood. Hadorian landed a blow that knocked Aaron's sword from his hand. The broken blade clattered away and slid toward a fissure. Aaron stumbled, chest heaving. Hadorian raised his sword to finish it. This was the betrayal that had been planted long ago, the one that always came when men could not trust. Rill moved without thinking. He lunged and drove a small knife into Hadorian's thigh, a clumsy strike, not deep, but enough to shock. Hadorian gasped, turning, eyes blazing. "You," he snarled. Rill's face was wet with tears, but his voice came clear. "No," he said, "not again." Aaron, seizing the moment, grabbed a jagged rock and slammed it into Hadorian's temple. Hadorian crumpled, blood dark against ash. Aaron stared down at him, breath ragged. He felt no victory, only sorrow for what fear had made of men. They dragged Hadorian's body to the side, out of the path, because even betrayal deserved some small dignity. Then they entered Samath Nar. Inside, the heat was like a living thing. The air shimmered. The floor was cracked stone, and beneath the cracks glowed fire. The sound of the mountain was constant, a deep rumble like the breathing of an immense beast. Rill stood at the edge of the fire chasm and unwrapped the ring with shaking fingers. It lay on his palm, plain and dark, yet it seemed to drink the light. Aaron watched him, eyes fixed, aware that this moment balanced ages. He thought of Estolad, though he had never heard the name, thought of that first refusal that had seemed so small. He thought of all the ways history had narrowed into this single point, a small hand above a fire. Rill's voice was barely audible over the rumble. "It wants me to keep it," he said. Aaron's throat tightened. "Yes," he said, "it will." Rill's fingers curled around it. Sweat dripped from his brow. His breathing quickened. For an instant, his eyes looked strange, distant, as if something else peered through them. "Rill," Aaron said sharply. "Look at me." Rill blinked. His gaze met Aaron's, and in that gaze was home. Wet earth, warm bread, a father's rough hands, Daisy's quiet questions by the hearth. "I want my home," Rill whispered again, and this time it was not fear, it was resolve. He flung the ring into the fire. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The ring fell, spinning, catching the red glow, then vanished into flame. The relief that surged through Aaron was so sudden it made him dizzy. He laughed once, a broken sound, and sank to his knees. The mountain's rumble changed pitch, deepening. The air vibrated. Outside, Barad-dûr trembled. Sauron felt it like a knife. Not the loss of the one, which still sat heavy on his hand, but the severing of a hidden thread he had been hunting. A lesser tool destroyed, a chance denied. His fury was immense, but beneath fury was something colder, realization. Someone had defied him inside his own land. He turned his gaze toward Orodruin, and in that gaze was command. The Nazgul came like a storm. Aaron hauled Rill up. "We must leave," he shouted. They ran out onto the ash slope as the mountain began to convulse. Lava burst from a fissure, splattering, sending up sparks like swarming insects. The sky above Mordor flashed with red light. Smoke billowed. For a few minutes, it felt like victory. It felt like the world itself had chosen to help them, shaking, punishing Sauron for overreach. Aaron and Rill stumbled down the path, half blind from heat and smoke, coughing until their lungs ached. Then the Nazgul descended. Their screams shredded the air. Shadows swept over the ground. Rill screamed too, a raw human sound. Edain wrapped an arm around him and kept moving, because stopping was death. A black rider struck, sweeping low. Its blade grazed Edain's shoulder, cutting through cloth and flesh. Pain flared hot. Edain nearly fell, caught himself, dragged Rill onward. At the edge of the ravine where Maera had died, the ground split. A river of lava surged through, cutting off their path. Heat blasted their faces. Edain stared at it, heart hammering. On the other side, the land dropped toward a rough trail that might lead away. Here, they were trapped. Rill sobbed. "We cannot," he gasped. Edain looked around wildly. Rocks crumbled. Ash blew in choking gusts. Above, wings beat, circling. Then, from the smoke, came horse hooves. A small band of riders burst into view, their horses lathered, eyes wild. At their head rode a man with a spear and no sigil, his face streaked with ash. One of the rebels who had sounded the horn on the plains. Not Eofred, who was dead, but another who carried his memory. He reined in hard at the lava's edge, eyes widening as he took in the scene. "You!" he shouted to Edain. "Jump!" Edain stared. The gap was wide. The heat was fierce. The rider yanked a rope from his saddle and tossed the end across. It landed short, singeing, but close enough. Edain lunged, grabbed it. The rope burned his palm. He tied it around Rill's waist with shaking hands. "Hold on," he said. Rill's eyes were huge with terror. "I cannot," he whispered. Edain's voice turned fierce. "Yes, you can," he said. "You already did the hardest part." He shoved Rill forward. The riders hauled. Rill slid over the ash, screaming as heat licked him, then swung over the lava on the rope, feet kicking above molten rock. The rope smoked. His skin reddened. The riders pulled with desperate strength and yanked him onto their side. Edain took the rope around his own waist. He looked up. A Nazgul dove. There was no time. He leapt. For an instant he hung above the fire, the world roaring beneath him, the air tearing at his lungs. The rope jerked. His shoulder screamed in pain. He swung hard, nearly slamming into the rock wall, then hands grabbed him, hauling him up. He collapsed on the far side, coughing, eyes streaming. The riders did not speak. And they only turned their horses and fled, carrying two fugitives away from the mountain as Mordor shook behind them. In the days that followed, news spread in whispers. Orodruin had erupted, yes, but Barad-dûr still stood. Sauron still wore the One. The world had not been freed. The shadow had not been banished. Yet something had changed, subtle as the first crack in ice. Sauron's servants scoured the land with heightened cruelty, because fear is the reflex of power when it is surprised. Tribute increased. Punishments became public. In Minas Tirith, bodies hung from the gates. In Rohan's plains, villages were burned as examples. In the Shire, tax collectors came with extra men and colder eyes. And still, beneath the cruelty, people began to talk about defiance as if it were a contagious thing. In a tavern in Gondor's lower city, a fisherman whispered to a friend, "Someone went into Mordor and came out." His friend shook his head, incredulous. "That is a lie," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "What if it is not?" the fisherman murmured. In the Shire, Daisy heard a rumor from a peddler that a little person had stood on the mountain of fire itself. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, then went quiet. Hamfast saw her expression and frowned. "Do not fill your head with tales," he warned. Daisy looked at him, eyes steady. "Maybe tales are all we have left," she said. "And maybe they are enough to start something." in the hidden valley near the Misty Mountains, the weary elf stood by the stream again, listening. He felt the world shift slightly, like a sail catching a new wind. It was not a wind of salvation. It was only a wind of possibility, and possibility is dangerous. He spoke aloud, though no one stood beside him. "So, it begins," he said. Relief had come in that brief moment when the ring fell into fire, when 2 small lives escaped Orodruin. It was real relief, like clean water after drought. Yet disquiet followed it immediately, because Sauron remained, and because the old wound between men and elves had not been healed by a single act of courage. Edain recovered slowly in a rebel camp in the hills. His shoulder healed crooked. He woke at night sweating, hearing Mairas' last shout, hearing the Nazgûl scream. Rill sat outside often, staring at the stars, quieter now, older in the eyes. One evening, Edain joined him. "You did it," Edain said. Rill did not look away from the sky. "I threw a ring," he said, "and Meera died. And that captain died, and Sauron still rules." Edain's breath fogged in the cold. "Yes," he said, "all true." Rill's voice trembled. "Was it worth it?" he asked. This was the question planted in Estelad, in every hearthside argument, in every choice to survive instead of stand. What is a life worth if it buys only more suffering? Edain answered slowly, because he knew the weight of the words. "It was worth it," he said, "because for the first time in an age, someone proved that the shadow can be entered and resisted. That changes people. It changes what they believe is possible." Rill finally looked at him. "And what if people believe, and they rise, and they die?" he asked. Edain's gaze held steady. "Then they will not die kneeling," he said. In Minas Tirith, Hadorian's absence was noticed. Officials whispered. The Eye's servants searched records, interrogated guards. A young soldier who had once asked if it would always be like this was dragged away for questioning and did not return. His mother wept in a stairwell that smelled of old stone and mold, muffling her sobs with her apron. In Rohan, rebel riders struck supply lines, then vanished. Each raid was small, almost meaningless against Mordor's vastness. Yet each raid was a reminder. Obedience was not complete. In Lindon, far to the west, Círdan felt a faint tremor in the world and looked east. The sea wind was cold on his face. He remembered a child asking if he would save them, long ago on a broken coast. Perhaps no one would save Middle-earth in a single stroke. Perhaps saving would be a long, bitter thing made of many small defiances. An elf beside him, younger, asked, "Do you think men will ever stand with us now?" Círdan's eyes narrowed toward the horizon. "They already have," he said. "Not in armies, in whispers, in choices. And will it be enough?" And the younger elf pressed. Círdan did not answer at once. The sea crashed against the shore, relentless. Gulls cried overhead, sharp and wild. At last, he said, "Enough is a word for endings. We are not at an ending." In the years that followed, the rebellion did not become a shining host. It became a network of quiet refusals. A gate left unlatched, a message carried across borders, a storehouse sabotaged, a child hidden when collectors came. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and not because they believed in victory, but because they could no longer endure the shame of submission. Yet Sauron adapted. He always did. He tightened his grip. He sent spies into rebel camps. He offered pardons and rewards to those who betrayed. One winter, a rebel leader sold out Erin's camp for a chest of silver and the promise his family would be spared. The attack came at dawn. Snow was falling, soft and thick, muffling screams until blades made them sharp. Tents burned. Horses shrieked. Men died half awake, clutching blankets. Rill ran through smoke, heart pounding, and saw Edain fighting near a supply cart, blood on his face. Rill shouted his name. Edain looked up, eyes widening. "Run!" Edain roared. Rill froze, because he had run his whole life. He could not do it again. A black arrow struck Edain in the side. He staggered. Another struck his throat. His shout cut off. He fell into the snow, red blooming around him like a grotesque flower. Rill screamed and lunged toward him, but a hand grabbed his collar and yanked him back. It was Daisy. She had left the Shire months earlier, carrying bread and a small knife, seeking the rumor that had lit her mind. Now her face was streaked with soot and tears. She dragged Rill into a ditch as the camp burned. "You cannot save him," she hissed. Rill sobbed, shaking violently. "He saved me," he choked. Daisy's grip tightened and her voice broke. "Then you save someone else," she whispered. "That is how it works." They escaped into the storm, the two small figures swallowed by snow, while behind them the rebels died and Mordor's servants laughed. This, too, could have been an ending. Hope crushed again, the pattern repeating, betrayal rewarded. And yet the very act of betrayal proved something else, something bitter. The rebellion had become dangerous enough to buy with silver. Sauron felt it. He increased his vigilance. He feared not a single army, but the spread of disobedience like rot in a beam. In the transformed world that followed, Middle-earth did not become bright. It became tense, like a bowstring drawn too long. The shadow remained dominant, yet it could not quite settle into complacency. The elves, fewer than ever, began to send quiet emissaries again, not to demand oaths, but to offer help in secret. Some men accepted, some refused. The old wound did not vanish. It began slowly to scar. Rill and Daisy traveled from place to place, carrying messages, carrying food, carrying the memory of Edain and Maera like a weight that steadied them. They met a dwarf who smuggled weapons under sacks of salt. They met a Gondorian widow who hid fugitives in a cellar that smelled of onions and damp stone. They met a Rohirric boy who practiced riding in secret, whispering old horse names like prayers. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes people died because of the messages they carried. Sometimes people lived. In Lindon, the weary elf by the stream finally left his valley and walked west to the sea. His feet sank into wet sand. He watched the horizon where ships sometimes passed, carrying the last of his kind away. He did not board. He turned back toward the east instead, toward smoke and struggle. His choice was not grand. It was simply a refusal to abandon a world still capable of courage. The thematic truth of this altered age settled like cold dew. Alliances are not made only between kings. They are made in moments when someone chooses to risk themselves for a stranger. The Edain had refused once, long ago, and the refusal had shaped centuries of darkness. But refusals could be answered, not by rewriting the past, but by rewriting what men believed about themselves. And yet, over everything, the eye remained. One night, on a ridge overlooking Mordor's distant glow, Rill and Daisy paused. The wind was sharp. The grass was brittle with frost. Below them, far off, a line of torches moved like a slow serpent, another column of Sauron's troops marching to crush some rumor of defiance. Daisy wrapped her cloak tighter. "Do you think we will ever see it fall?" she asked. Rill stared at the torches, then up at the stars. "I do not know," he said. He thought of Estolad, though he had never heard the name, thought of that first choice made for love and fear. He thought of Maera's knife flashing in ash. He thought of Elrond's voice telling him he was not alone. He thought of the small relief of fire swallowing the ring. Then he answered, and his voice was quiet but steady. "Maybe it does not fall in our lifetime," he said. "Maybe it falls because we taught someone else not to kneel." Behind them, the world was dark. Ahead, Mordor burned. Above, the stars shone cold and distant, and no new star had ever been set in the sky to promise that the Valar were watching. Only the choices of the living remained, fragile and furious as a match in wind. In the far east, beyond maps most never saw, Sauron stood in his tower and looked out across his realm. His hand, bearing the one, tightened slowly. He could not see Rill and Daisy on their ridge. He did not need to. He felt, somewhere in the fabric of his dominion, the faint, irritating pulse of disobedience. He smiled, because he had all the time in the world, and because he believed time always favors the cruel. Far away, on that ridge, the torches below continued their march, and the frost on the grass glittered like tiny shards of glass, as if the earth itself had been broken and left scattered under the feet of those still walking.